All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our third episode of Energy Talks, hosted by Policy.lk. My name is Shiyana Gunasekara. I'm an international energy consultant based in Washington, D.C. I specialize in natural gas and LNG and also the South Asia region. So this is a particularly exciting episode for me since we'll be talking about natural gas and LNG in Sri Lanka. In a few moments, I'll be passing the mic to Tisura Gamage, our other co-host, to introduce our guest, Saliya Wickramasuriya. Before that, I did want to give a quick primer on natural gas and LNG, so we have a little bit of context for today's discussion. So natural gas has become quite an important fuel in the last couple of decades now, as major reserves have been found and more countries are looking to curb their fossil fuel emissions and diversify their energy mixes. Natural gas is considered to be the cleanest burning fossil fuel, but it's still a fossil fuel nonetheless. And it's cleaner burning compared to coal and oil, which are commonly found in not only Sri Lanka, but also in the energy mixes of India and China and our neighbors around South and Southeast Asia. It's been particularly important to reduce carbon emissions in Europe and the US, but like I said, countries like China and India are also looking at natural gas in order to displace oil and coal in energy intensive sectors like transportation, the industrial sector, and power. We also will be hearing a little bit about liquefied natural gas, so LNG. It becomes more relevant when you consider how to transport natural gas across faraway distances. So natural gas is quite difficult to transport in these long distances, especially in its original state. So natural gas is then cooled down to about negative 160 degrees Celsius and therefore shrinks by about a factor of 600. And it becomes essentially a liquid in a liquid state. So in order to import LNG, a country needs to build significant import, regasification, and pipeline infrastructure, which is not cheap. Relatively new technologies, however, might help smaller and low-income countries like Sri Lanka import LNG. Small-scale LNG is one of those technologies that, when you think about Sri Lanka, it allows them to reduce their capital expenditures and be a bit more flexible when it comes to importing another fossil fuel. Small-scale LNG is an alternative to the very large, large LNG infrastructures that are fixed on land. And it's typically for the trade of lower volumes, so approximately 1 million tons or less, which is roughly about what Sri Lanka is looking to possibly import in its first phase of imports in the first several years. One of the small-scale technologies that you might have heard about is called an FSRU. It stands for Floating Storage and Regasification Unit. And these are essentially vessels that have storage and LNG regasification technology on board. So they can transport the LNG and also do the work of regasification offshore, off of the land, and deliver natural gas to the end user eventually through pipeline infrastructure and whatnot. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, FSRUs require significantly less capital expenditure and less space than their onshore counterparts. And for a country like Sri Lanka, that might also have gas reserves discovered in the future, and that can eventually be used domestically. FSRUs can be eventually dismissed and serve another market as soon as a contract is up. And speaking of FSRUs a little bit further in terms of what we've heard in the media, we have heard so far a few projects proposed, one by a South Korean company, another by an Indian and Japanese, a consortium of Japanese companies, and also another project in Hambantota proposed by a Chinese company. And I know some other natural gas and LNG projects that come to mind is a 300 megawatt LNG power plant. And I believe we're also seeing some interest from US companies in building capacity to essentially generate emergency power fueled by either natural gas or LNG directly. And I think with this overview, it might be a good time to pass the mic to Tisura so he could properly introduce our guest and kick off our questions.
Well, thank you, Shiyana. That was a great introduction and a segue to our topic today. And I want to welcome Saliya for taking his time off to really come and join us, talk to us today. So my name is Tisura, and I am a PhD student who study energy and transportation. I know Saliya doesn't want to spend too much time on introducing him, but I just try to do it in like a few words. He has a lot of experience under his belt. So Saliya worked as the Director General of the Petroleum Resource Development Secretariat in Sri Lanka from 2011 to 2017. I think that was the time when Sri Lanka really started talking about natural gas in a very serious context. Before that, he served in very serious positions. He was, if I'm not mistaken, chairman of the BOI long time ago. He worked with the Schlumberger Group for a big part of his life at the early stages. And right now, Saliya works as a consultant to the Ministry of Energy in Sri Lanka, and you are part of the Resources Development Committee. And it's a pleasure to have you with us, Saliya, to answer all questions relating to the future of Sri Lanka's future with natural gas, potential future, if I'd say add. I think to get it started, let me ask maybe like the first question so that Saliya can really dive into the deep end of things. So I properly met Saliya last year at the public comments period initiated by the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka, and they had a public review for the draft natural gas policy that was initiated by the government of Sri Lanka. So can I ask Saliya, what was the significance of that natural gas, so the draft natural gas policy? Can you tell us what was the background of it? What was the need for such a natural gas policy? And last year it was a draft. Can you tell us what has happened to it since then? Is anybody talking about it now? Or since there was a government change from last year, what's the take from the new government? Over to you, Saliya.
Thank you, Tisura and Shiyana, for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be on policy.lk, and I wish you and both of you and your initiatives in the energy sector all success. On the policy, it's been on a long and windy road because it started as a requirement for our 2013 bid round in order to convey government intent vis-a-vis the monetizing of offshore deposits of gas if found by exploration companies or oil and gas companies we wanted to attract to start exploring in Sri Lanka. And that was back in 2013, and it's been around and about since then as an essential part of the legal base, as an essential part of the background, if you like, the above ground factors for oil and gas companies to consider investing in a region. So we met soon after 2019, excuse me, at which point this document had actually gone through several versions and iterations. And in its final form, it was 80% complete, and it had a few key things unsaid. So what happened after that town hall was that it was rewritten in certain parts. And if you're still having with you the document that was discussed at the town hall, that document has now been superseded, quite extensively rewritten in certain parts, which is primarily the policy objectives and the policy framework. Those have been embellished somewhat to more align with part of its original intent. This became all the more important because with all the discussions going on on the LNG projects Shiyana mentioned, it was important to understand how potential investors in either the upstream or the downstream side looked at Sri Lanka as potential market. because it's not a virtual market, it's a real market. It's not like anything else we can do in Sri Lanka. We can export into countries with preferential market access. Gas must be consumed here. And oil is not necessarily a problem, so we don't need an oil policy, but we certainly do need to show our intent as a gas policy. So it has been rewritten, it has been updated, it has been superseded. So I would invite you to particularly look at sections 3 and 4 whenever and all the participants have a chance, if you wish, and you will see the differences that have been introduced.
Thank you, Saliya. I just want to take this moment to remind everyone who's viewing to please submit any questions that they might have either on Zoom in the comment box or on Facebook, and we'll be tracking those very closely so we can quickly pose those questions to Saliya. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and ask one of my questions. Saliya, I've had a whole list of questions for you, but I have had to shrink them for the purpose of this discussion. So one of my big questions is, why natural gas, another hydrocarbon, and a relatively expensive or maybe price volatile import for Sri Lanka? And how do we develop demand essentially for a fuel that does not yet have a customer base in Sri Lanka?
Thanks, Shiyana. That's a great question. And that actually is one of the objectives of the policy, is to create a formalized market for the gas that we eventually produce. Now, looking at the end game would be economically to produce gas from Sri Lanka's domestic reserves, assuming we were consuming gas by then. As you say, it's being rapidly replaced. It's becoming a transition fuel in most parts of the world because of the rapid advance of renewable energy technology. But here in Sri Lanka, wherever there is coal and oil in the energy space or the energy mix, there is room for gas. We are a long way from moving towards 60, 70, 80% renewable. The target is being debated right now, but the stated target is 80% renewable power generation by 2030. That does put pressure on the gas market, certainly. So in other words, we don't want to lose out on the end game by letting time slip to where it then becomes economically unviable, because under all conditions, having gas-based power generation has advantages over coal or oil. From different points of view, we can discuss those as we go along. So one of the objectives of these LNG projects is to create the demand that would raise this, if you like, broaden the, it would leverage the markets, reduce the price, increase the scale of demand so that it actually brings down the barrier to entry for natural gas that's produced offshore. So wherever we have, in other words, wherever we are using a form of energy in terms of power generation alone, I'm talking about now, that is coal or fossil or fuel-based, there is still room for gas in that discussion.
Mm-hmm. So let me probably ask the next question where you finished off. Can you bring the context of the discussion around natural gas to the power sector in Sri Lanka, to the energy sector? So can you tell us maybe your vision, but also how others are also discussing it? How does natural gas fit into the larger power sector or the electricity sector discussions in Sri Lanka? So I guess what I'm essentially asking is, who will be the stakeholders and who will be the government agents, the government authorities who will be maybe regulating natural gas? Will there be an agency for price setting and oversight, who will be essentially setting up, and this again comes back to the natural gas policy. So can you give us a little context in how natural gas or where fits in with the electricity policy, the energy policy?
Yeah, the biggest stakeholder is the consumer, that's us. Because the expectation of introducing any gas, any change of any nature into the power generation mix would be to be one or all of the following: reduce cost, reduce emissions, decrease carbon footprint, reduce socioeconomic impact, and a whole variety of things. So natural gas ticks all those boxes. So from an energy standpoint, we are looking at the fact that if eventually we migrate consumption of natural gas in whatever sector to domestic gas consumption, then the cost, the resource cost is zero, leaving aside the capital cost. So from that point of view, really, we shouldn't be talking cost here. We should be talking economic value. So in other words, cost is today's number. Economic value is that number spread out with its variances over the next 25 years. So if you look at economic value, then natural gas does have a role to play, even if its contribution to power generation is small. Because the larger you scale up domestic supply, then the lower the price point comes and the more viable certain industries like fertilizer, manufacturing, even distribution of gas to townships, city gas, if you like, becomes viable. So who are the stakeholders in this? The regulation is done in two stages. There's the upstream regulation, which is more the level playing field between potential oil and gas producers, E&P companies. And there's the downstream regulation, which is potentially to manage gas pricing in the community. The upstream regulation is now changing in its form. There hasn't been a formal regulator. The PRDS has been the de facto regulator, but the new law, now we talked about policy. Policy on its own is meaningless unless unless it's supported in law. So we are in order to support that policy, because otherwise you can't implement policy if you don't have a legal framework to enforce it. So in order to create that legal framework, we are now revising the Petroleum Act, which the current one is now going to be repealed and replaced with one that clearly defines those questions. The PRDS will become a PRD authority and look after upstream regulation, which means sorting out issues between different producers primarily. And the Public Utilities Commission will be the regulator of the gas pricing on the downstream side. And it'll all be centered through a single ministry. And there will be one company, which is Sri Lanka's version of a national oil and gas company, such as, for example, ONGC in India. There will be one formed through which all gas transactions will happen, whether they are natural gas domestically produced or imported and regasified. Does that give you an outline, nutshell?
Yes, maybe as a quick follow-up to that, I think a lot of the people in our audience really wants to know that, before we develop our domestic resources and what's going to happen during that time period, maybe that gap. People are talking about, importing LNG, like maybe if I read the newspaper articles correctly, maybe in the next few months, there could be, like a quickly set up natural gas plant with maybe LNG imports. How will that fit in? And if that's the case, do you think there might be problems for domestically, like incentives for really domestically produced LNG here?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it all depends on how it is sequenced and managed, which is where government intervention at this stage of the operation here is important in terms of its coordinating roles. So we've had several discussions with different actors. At the moment, because of the policy being brand new and no act to support it, there are different actors in the picture, somewhat independently, operating somewhat independently. And we hope that before too long, we will simply by coordination align our various interests and goals. And now, from that standpoint, my personal view is any project of any scale that actually breaks down the barrier of having no gas consumption in Sri Lanka and introduces it in some form, even if it's in a limited form, in small quantities to power generation, will actually make an impact on our economy in the long term, because there is a lot of potential that gas demand and gas supply can unlock. And maybe this is not the forum for that, but there is a lot of potential to be unlocked there. So now, in a few months, gas is, as Shiyana mentioned, is becoming more scalable. It's becoming cheaper in terms of infrastructure. It is becoming cheaper in terms of transport. It's certainly cheaper in terms of price on the main exchanges now. So it's not unfeasible to have a short-term gas project, which is based on some form of temporary import infrastructure, either small barges, ISO containers, bullets, gas bullets, regasification at site. There's a variety of different technologies that emerge at different price points that can make these things happen. So the question is, what part of that does it occupy of the big picture? And that question has not yet been fully spelled out. So we have all these somewhat confusing and sometimes conflicting projects offering a whole bunch. If you aggregate them all, there's enough gas in there for the next 25 years for Sri Lanka. So it simply means that not all of these projects will succeed. In fact, my feeling is that the very first one will automatically erase those that haven't started yet. So there is a strategic importance here in moving fast. And personally, I think whoever moves fast makes the market impact. So I mean, it's a fairly complex scenario. We have projects being proposed in all these different places, as Shiyana pointed out. Not all of them are at the same stage of approval. Not all of them are at the same stage of due diligence. And not all of them are at the same stage of readiness. So from that point of view, it's a matter of keeping an eye on them all and seizing the most viable and earliest to market project from amongst them.
Yes. So let me pass the baton to Shiyana, and I think you can incorporate an audience question coming in next. Shiyana, over to you.
Yep, that's right. So one of my questions, like Tisura said, I'll be incorporating with one of the audience questions here. So should advocates of renewable energy be worried about the prospect of natural gas gaining some market share in key sectors like power? And I'll kind of tag on the audience question here. With the world in general moving towards renewables, investors are scaling back on investments in oil and gas. Does it make sense to go down the LNG or natural gas path at this point in time? Does it make sense from an economic and environmental point of view? I do believe you touched on the economic point a little bit, but maybe you can flesh it out a little bit more here.
Yeah, that's a very valid question. They are both valid questions, Shiyana. The world is moving towards renewable energy. I absolutely agree. I don't see the same rush in Sri Lanka. So the moment we have our policy aligned with moving aggressively towards renewable energy, I do believe the gas that we have around us can stay in the ground. But unless and until such a clear policy direction is adopted and actually executed, implemented, Sri Lanka still seems to be importing fossil fuels in the form of coal and oil. So it's a matter of, we are not as a country yet aligning with the global trends in renewables. We look at them very closely. We talk about them a lot, but we have not succeeded in harnessing their benefit to our economy. So that brings us to the bottom line, which is, if we use gas at all, let it be our gas. So that's why I said that would be the end game. And gas is now, just to give you a context here, I think the whole power generation picture is changing, where the old concept of coal-powered base load plants that chug along day in, day out at the same load factor for 95% of the time, that's now being replaced by smart grids, dispatch management, and coordination of virtual power plants, which are actually renewables plus batteries. So I mean, the concept of baseload power is now being replaced by that of firm power, which is where you have fallback power sitting with a sufficient sufficient spinning reserve in there, if you like, to rise up to meet peak demands and tank down to when your renewables are outputting more. So it's going from a practical physical infrastructure game to an electronic and modeling and integration of renewable energy game management, grid management, power management. We in Sri Lanka have not seen this transition happen yet. So while we are working in the old paradigm and the world is moving along into the new one, we still need to do the best we can in the old paradigm, which is, if we are going to use fossil fuel, let it be gas. And if it's going to be gas, let the end game be domestic gas, so that we can remove that as an import substitution eventually.
Absolutely, that makes sense to me. And this actually leads to pretty well to my next question, which is, we've heard about this new LNG power plant that's been cabinet approved. There's so many different levels of approval, like from the lower level, from lower level to a true commitment. Could you tell us what this approval means in terms of a commitment to an LNG power plant?
I wish I could, but I can't. I haven't seen the documents that go behind this, this cabinet approval, haven't seen the cabinet approval, haven't seen the observations, haven't seen the decisions. Now, that's partly because I've only just rejoined the government in terms of, in this advisory capacity, Ministry of Energy. And there's, over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been lots of morphing, norming, and forming of projects. So I personally have not seen any structured feasibility study or any FEED study, front-end engineering and design study, that would give me the confidence that any proposal that has been thus far submitted to cabinet approval is both practically and economically feasible. So that's my personal view. Presumably, people out there have. But I think there's a lot of positioning going on for approvals. Practically, what will separate, the rubber will meet the road when the government says, right, go ahead to any one of them, and they need to get into the cycle of financial closure, insurance, and so on and so forth, which is where I think the minefields are, because funding is dropping for non-green fuel systems worldwide. LNG is still hanging in there, but certainly coal and oil are being dropped aggressively from different multilateral lending portfolios. And also we are a very small market, so we're not going to make a dent in anybody's appetite. So from that point of view, the feasibility of these projects needs to be very thoroughly examined before we can take them seriously. Now, that's not to say that their intent is not there behind them, but I have not seen anything personally that would convince me that any one of these projects is ready for the green light and go.
Right. I do want to make one point. We had one comment saying natural gas power plants, there are no LNG power plants. So just to be clear from the offset, when I mentioned, or when any of us mentioned LNG, we're referring to imported natural gas, because this first needs to be liquefied before it's then regassed and used in our infrastructure. So I'll be referring to natural gas as domestically sourced natural gas, but LNG will be referring to imports. And this is actually like quite related to my big question on pricing, which you touched on a little bit earlier. Electricity is considered one of the most price sensitive sectors in not only Sri Lanka, but all of South Asia. You did mention that LNG prices are relatively low these days, but there might be, another couple months. I mean, we're heading into winter. We might see some highs. Who knows? But do you still think that given the volatility of natural gas and LNG prices, that we could still, that poses a threat to end user electricity prices, especially in Sri Lanka where it's currently subsidized?
So just to understand the question carefully, are you saying that the volatility in the LNG markets, could that pose a threat to the consumers in this price sensitive market?
Right.
Okay, so you partly answered your question, Shiyana, because you mentioned the word subsidized. So actually the risk is not on the consumer as much as, or the industry as much as the government that is subsidizing it. So from that standpoint, the government that chooses to subsidize anything then takes the risk of market fluctuations, the market risk of the commodity they're subsidizing. If we, I don't see a huge climb in LNG pricing for several reasons. you mentioned some of them, which is where the market has actually fragmented, broken up. There have been all sorts of new business models emerging worldwide because of the the huge expansion year on year on year, the market growth. In particular, the spot market has increased in size to 30–40% of total LNG traded. And while I'm not saying that we need to start dealing on the spot market from day one, it provides opportunities which we can avail of as part of our, if you like, a procurement portfolio. And from that point of view, there is a buffer. There needs to be a buffer, a pricing buffer between what we buy and what we charge. And that you highlighted a very key requirement here, which is the mapping, the economic mapping of the impact of fluctuations of LNG price. If it's, as you correctly say, if you're referring to the import, and the lower the import price goes, the higher the barrier gets for domestic consumption, because the more challenging economic returns become and the internal rates of return of those projects drop. So it's a balancing act, which is why we do need to sit back and take a picture that there are several things we need to look at. One is what's happening out there. The other one is how we're going to share it internally, distribute the market internally. Power is the initial market, but there is a lot more out there that we can use LNG for. I beg your pardon, natural gas. I'm a petroleum engineer myself. I fall into the same trap. It's all natural gas. Not a single industry uses LNG. So yeah, so there's a lot we can do. That's all part of how the government approaches the pricing policy and the subsidy policy, which itself must, in my opinion, be based on some kind of analysis of long-term economic benefit. So I don't think, the short answer is, I don't think it's a risk for the consumer if the government decides it should be.
Shiyana, I think we have a few questions coming from the panel. We can open it up so when they can ask it themselves. If you want to proceed that way.
Sure. Yep. I see a question from Vidura. If you want to unmute yourself and come online, you can go ahead and ask your question yourself.
And we also had a question from Parakrama Jaisingh. I think we made him a panelist just about now. You can also unmute and ask the question yourself. But Vidura, if you want to ask it, it's up to you.
Hi, Saliya. Good seeing you. So my question is regarding what you mentioned on the electricity sector. Previously, the way the sectoral transformation was viewed as people would move from coal to gas to renewables. And this was because at a particular point of time, what the gas-based generation could do in terms of ramping certain types of grid services was not supported by any other technology. But this phase has passed, and there are many countries who are actually skipping the whole gas route, moving from coal to renewables. So the question I have is that while I understand that Sri Lanka is still locked in the older paradigm of base loads, and firm power is also of that sort, would not the gas development or gas introduction into the electricity sector, especially looking at the way the utility is looking at it, sort of stave off the surge of renewables? And I ask this with a specific reference, and as you clearly know, one of the reasons of the utilities' refusal to accept the 80% renewable target by 2030 is the fact that there are so many cabinet-approved gas projects, and once we build them, there is not enough space for renewables to come in. So we actually see it happening on the ground. So within that context, isn't there a risk, and especially when you start investing on infrastructure such as the FSRUs, the terminals, wouldn't that create a condition that will halt the transitioning into a very high renewable scenario in the country?
Put like that, yes, it could, Vidura. I do agree. Which is why I fall back on my my original suggestion here is that the coordination bit, there needs to be a clear identification of target, goal at a national level, and that should base itself on economics, environmental sustainability, and a whole variety of other factors. And once that is done, it might rule out the need for gas as a transition fuel. I do agree. I'm wearing a different cap now. I think if it'll be wonderful if we can actually go from where we are now to where we want to be in terms of the power sector without using gas. But then I would also say that would require most of our other fossil fuels to be phased out. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg. As long as we have fossil fuels in the mix, it is better that those fossil fuels are gas. And if there is gas in the mix, it is better that the strategy is aligned that, if necessary, continuing to produce domestic gas. I don't know if I answered that question, your question.
In part, and the reason I'm so just a quick follow-up, Saliya, and the more concern on this is because you earlier also mentioned that because there are a lot of players who are trying to get into the market, the first player who will enter into the market will shut out others, and the reason why it is concerned is that if you look at what is on the table, all of the projects that are currently on the market is introduction of natural gas through the LNG route purely for electricity generation. It does not look at the larger use of gas at any point of time. So this itself appears to me is something that is not done through a very clear articulated policy at a national level, which looks at energy as a whole, but as opposed to different stakeholders trying to optimize their own space.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. That part is missing. Now we have a national natural gas policy that is created to give substance to the government's intent in attracting people primarily on the upstream side. Essentially, it started as an upstream policy, and it still remains that way. So if we continue to aspire to produce oil and gas, then that policy will have to drive its way into the broader management of natural gas, as Shiyana pointed out, as a commodity, as an energy source, whether it comes from domestically produced methane or whether it is imported and regasified gas. So I'm not arguing with you. I entirely see the dilemma that we're in. It is, to me, an entirely self-imposed problem. We haven't really analyzed and optimized on the basis of where we want to be in 20 years' time. We haven't done that. Now, you mentioned countries that have skipped natural gas. Yes, so look at India, for example. They're moving aggressively straight from coal to renewable. So yes, I'm agreeing with you, actually.
Thank you, Saleh. I think we have a few more questions from the audience. Parakrama Jaisingh has asked a question. Parakrama, do you want to ask the question yourself?
Yes, okay. Saliya, great to be listening to you. As usual, you are coming up with all the right answers. Now, my primary, actually, I should put up my second question first. You mentioned that we should be looking at more on the economic gains of it rather than looking at the cost and financial district. So looking at from that point of view, shouldn't we have a firm policy? If you are going for gas, it has to be Sri Lankan gas, indigenous gas, full stop. You see, it's from that point onwards that I would like to go with my second question to say that would conversion of the 900 megawatts give enough of a capacity to make it worthwhile to start developing Nana gas? If not, what other sectors that we might be able to tap on to as step by step, perhaps? And while I'm on the line, I would like to say that there was suggestions that our transport should be converted to gas, which I totally disagree, because we have much has changed. Electric vehicles is the way to go. So even if you do use that one, that essentially must be a very short-term process till the conversion happens. So those are the three basic things I want to check with you.
Thanks, Para. Good to talk with you again as well. Yes, I agree. First, I also don't see personally, I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if you were on the panel at the time, that I haven't seen many proper economic study. You know, there are numbers thrown out, $15 per MMBTU, $18 per MMBTU, $20 per MMBTU. To me, they mean nothing unless they're supported, because the gas market and gas pricing is a very dynamic, it's a very dynamic landscape. It's changing all the time. So what was today X is tomorrow going to be a factor of X one way or the other, which means that anybody who is proposing these projects, and there have been, as we heard, 3 or 4 of them, are proposing these on some basis which may or may not have expired. So, you know, in pursuit of your first point, which is Sri Lankan gas, that now I'm wearing that hat, that we are aggressively pursuing on a smaller scale, offering, and I can't describe this in too much detail at this point, but offering a lighter entry and essentially encouraging oil and gas companies to commence production into an assured market for a particular purpose in a particular manner that will then put pressure on the viability of everything else. So while what you're saying is nice to be done by policy, I think we are too far gone down the roads of diplomatic discussions, negotiations, and promises of projects to other actors to suddenly back off and say, look, we don't want you guys. We're going to develop our own. So I think diplomatically, that's a challenge for us. So it's now down to survival of the fittest, who can put together an economically financeable, insurable, bankable package to produce something from Sri Lanka's gas reservoirs and provide it to the sector in the form of power or anything else for that matter, I mean, gas itself. Then I think we have government's commitment on that. So that part I can say is going to be accelerated, and depending on who actually wins that race, you may find that we do ultimately get Sri Lankan gas first for the gas that we need. Okay, now your second question, it was 900 megawatts enough? Yes. For that, for the strategies we have spelled out, for that, it is. And it's not even necessary. In fact, we are looking at a smaller footprint. Monetization of gas, the models are changing, and the business models really are becoming more flexible now. So there's room for us to actually produce domestic gas into a smaller market than 900 megawatts, still with a reasonably good internal rate of return for the investors. But there are caveats associated with that outside of the scope of this call. And last, sorry, I'm looking at your questions, I've written them down. Transport, well, in its direct form, it's a challenge. It's a big ask. Compressed natural gas cylinders, that's a big infrastructure requirement. But in gas-derived liquid form, it's not so much of a challenge. So there is the possibility of using gas-derived liquids at sufficient, for that you need sufficient scale. And there are technologies that are rapidly catching up with DME, for example, which is with, and other drop-in fuel substitutes for both petrol and diesel that are gas-derived. And somewhere along the line in the next 4 or 5 years, we may be able to scale them down to where Sri Lanka can use the same technology.
I guess hopefully the Ministry of Energy could finance enough research or studies, policy studies to see what are the best options moving forward.
These are lots of people are doing it overseas. So all we need to do is speak to the right people. And I'm sure there's a lot to learn that's already been done. But
Right.
I do agree. So the effort should be made to do that.
Exactly. Like a lot of the good studies are done here, even in the United States, but we don't know what are the unique challenges that might be, when you try to do it in Sri Lankan context. Shiyana, over to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just thinking, well, that's my job as a consultant. That's what we do. So, but I definitely think that there's starting to become more interest in Sri Lanka specifically in like the context of it being an island, being part of the greater South Asian market. So, especially being so close to India, which is one of the largest LNG importers in the world. So I think it does make sense to kind of look at Sri Lanka by itself. But yeah, I do think there's a lot of work already being done. So, Energy Ministry doesn't have to spend too much money, but it would be great to see that their policies are truly informed. All right, well, we do have some other questions I see here. I did have one that was submitted to me privately. Here is one question. Is there a roadmap for LNG specifically? Saliya, you talked about how the policy really focuses on domestic production, so on the upstream side. Is there a specific policy separate from domestic production that focuses on importing natural gas?
No, there isn't, Shiyana. It's part and parcel of the same policy. It's addressed in the same policy. And we, in drafting the policy, I would say in refining the policy, we took the same approach as you did, which is gas, it's natural gas. That's what the end user uses. And the markets, the importers and the explorers, they take different market risk or they take different risk. One of those risks should not be market. Now, if you take an explorer, an E&P company, they have a below ground risk, above ground risk. Below ground risk are geotechnical, and if you throw enough technology at it, you can overcome that at a cost. Above ground risks are not within their purview to control. They include political, fiscal, financial, administrative, regulatory, all of that stuff. So from that point of view, we've got to, the cost of something has not yet, the requirement for LNG has not yet been defined to be in the long term. To me, to have as a redundancy, the ability to have recourse to a terminal of some scale or an import facility, even if it's a kind of a barge mounted power facility or a barge mounted regas facility, which is fed by smaller vessels. You mentioned SSLNG. Yes, absolutely, small scale LNG. That's a good redundancy feature for the power sector. But if we have sufficient scale in the offshore reserves that we do have, if we have sufficient quantities, then India and other markets open out to us. And these are discussions we are having with the people that can help us come to the right conclusions, which are the oil and gas companies. We're not talking to investors or we're actually discussing these challenges in this same language with the oil and gas companies to work out how best some of them, for example, can combine both the LNG part and the NG part. There are oil and gas companies that trade LNG, but also do E&P. So there are many different ways to skin that cat. And it's we don't want to be locked into any one particular policy. The policy is a natural gas policy, regardless of where the gas comes from. It's more defining how it is regulated, how it is managed, and what assurances it gives in terms of commercialization to investors.
Right.
Yes, and I think there's a question from Artha Salgado for a while. Artha, do you want to ask the question yourself, or shall we pick it up?
I'll ask it myself, because I think the question kind of will change a bit based on Vidura's question that came earlier. I guess Vidura raised the point about, when we have LNG and NG coming into the market, what sort of impact that would have on the RE development in the future. What is the possibility of converting existing fossil fuel based power stations and all that into LNG? What is the period of return, for example. I mean, if we install something now, what is the period of return for these investments, and how does that jive with what we've talked about with regards to a 2030 RE based grid, which we're talking about from a policy standpoint. The other one would be most of the oil and gas companies are using scenario-based risk analysis for the future to understand, transition risks and all this stuff. Is this being considered in this type of investment, and we're looking at policy frameworks in Sri Lanka?
Thanks, Arthur. Thank you very much. I'll answer your second question first, which is, are the oil and gas company risks being discussed? Yes, they are, with the oil and gas companies directly, which is what is leading us to maybe introduce different monetization and different risk mitigation models in order to encourage. Now, here's the end game here. This is not all about gas. The E&P strategy in Sri Lanka revolves around the fact that we do have oil as well. And now I know that that's a bad word to a lot of us, but it represents significant economic independence to us in the long term. So from that point of view, our intention in talking to oil and gas companies is to bring them into Sri Lanka in order to continue exploring and producing. Ultimately, we are hoping that we will be able to produce some oil. Sri Lanka's gas reserves don't attract anybody. Nobody will come into Sri Lanka for just the gas reserves we have, in comparison with the vast gas reservoirs that are out there and the huge gas projects that are coming online. So the fact that we are speaking with certain companies indicates that a potential for greater things is seen both on the oil front, the strategic front. There's a whole variety of different things, different currencies in the equation. So that's the risk that the oil companies see. We are testing directly with them. So there's no speculation there. And of course, it's leading us to rethink certain things. The policy part of it may change. The policy is a live and living document. If the government decides it wants to do a certain thing, then the policy will obviously be updated to reflect it. Now, to your first question, which is what Vidura was getting at, to me, it's a question of the tail wagging the dog. Now, you've got all these projects, the viability of which is questionable, and those are being used to tell the government, look, with all these projects, we then cannot do so much. I think it really should be the other way around. I think the government should decide at some point, do we want to go so much % RE by such and such a date? If so, let's come out and say it. And then let's take steps to make that happen by ramping up rapidly technology transfer in the renewable section, bringing in new models for the utility, a whole variety of other things. At the moment, it seems like these potential projects are driving policy. It should be policy driving potential projects. So right now we are in a bit of a hiatus, which is why there is an importance in moving fast and being the first in terms of being able to dictate or influence subsequent steps. I'm not sure if I answered your question there, but I just gave you what I see as the challenge here is where we are being forced down a certain path, a constrained renewable integration path by projects being proposed as being necessary. Now, I think a lot of our renewable energy can be brought on stream within the next 2 years, but I don't think we have the management systems, the dispatch management systems to deal with that yet. And that's lack of policy. So therefore, people have exploited that lack of intent by proposing all these emergency power, gas-based this, gas-based that, oil-based this, coal power expansion. And that in turn has squashed, inhibited the government from going up to the platform with a very powerful renewable policy. So like I said, it's the horse and the cart being reversed.
Thank you, Saliya. I think that was quite good. lots more questions, I guess, on the horizon.
Thank you,
I think-
Arthur.
Yeah, I think we have one more question from the audience, and I know we're kind of pushing up on the end of our time. If anyone has any other last minute questions, we can try to accommodate them, or we can send them directly to Saliya, and we can put you two in touch or make sure that your question is answered. So the last question here that I'm seeing is from Vidura. If you want to come back online and have his mic unmuted, and he can go ahead and ask his question.
Sure, Saliya, this is regarding the contracting process, especially. So we've been seeing contracts being visualized for FSRUs, for long-term gas supplies. And the question is really about whether we as a country actually have the skill for evaluating these contracts. And not compromising our national interest because of the technical nature of it. And what comes to my mind is how we actually got into a really bad situation with hedging, for example. And we've seen, for example, the mooring study for FSRU in one of the projects being done by Lanka Hydraulics Engineer Institute, which honestly doesn't have any ocean engineering skills. So we have projects, but whether there is sufficient due diligence is placed to preserve the national interest has been a question. So in your opinion, how do we de-risk this type of a complex projects as a nation? And I want to bring one aspect that you earlier mentioned, which is about the current LNG contract. And as you clearly know, one of the areas even we struggle even now is complexity of a straightforward power purchase agreement for a power plant. So if you cannot get that equation right, how do we get this type of equation in a way that doesn't harm our national interest, imagining the kind of lawyering that the counterparts will be bringing onto the table? How do you propose we handle it?
Great question. Now, the first step in any of these things, in my opinion, would be to make public the basis on which these projects are being fielded. In other words, take the FSRU project. It's evidently been done. There's evidently a 1,000-page document that's been done by some reputed company, but nobody else has seen it other than the CEB. So we have to take their word for it. Now, to answer another question that was woven in there, do we have the skills to do that? No, we certainly don't. Vidura, we in Sri Lanka, we have no experience on the downstream petroleum side other than in refining and marketing. We know nothing about natural gas, either in its natural form or its regasified form. And I don't say that in a derogatory way. I mean, we just don't have it. So the way to do this is to engage, to de-risk this project with
I think we are losing you, Saliya. Internet connection, perhaps. Well, while we wait for Saliya to come back, Shiyana, I think one of the important aspects of government agencies funding for research and of course studies, working with local universities, is that to develop that talent. And that's what I'm seeing with most US universities. I'm sure your experience must have been the same.
That's right. I mean, we have some great universities here in the US that specifically focus on oil and gas, but that's because we have our own resources here. And Sri Lanka has been, we've heard discussions about domestic resources offshore in the Mannar Basin, but we have, I don't think it's, the likelihood is still unclear, and that's why we haven't, kind of trickled that kind of training into the universities. But to meet that gap, that's really why we would invite international oil companies. And we've seen in other places, like in Africa, for example, international oil companies working with universities to make sure that they're trained up to be able to participate in in the country's economy and in developing and monetizing these natural resources. So I think Saliya is back.
I think Saliya is back. Hi, Saliya.
Hi,
Welcome.
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Sorry,
Why-
I just lost internet connection there for a moment. So I was telling Vidura, or in response to his question, I was explaining that we don't have a rigorous process of project evaluation in Sri Lanka, regardless of sector. In particular, with these long-term investments in the energy sector, which would require funding and insuring at a scale that is quite heavy compared to other risks we take as a nation, we must have that skill. So I'd like to see the documents brought out for discussion. There may be no Sri Lankans, including myself, who have the kind of country expertise required in country, but there certainly are Sri Lankans outside of Sri Lanka, and also people in, I mean, there are, any project of this magnitude must have a consultant. Now, when we build ports, we have the contractor and we have a consultant, as everybody does. Any project manager has a consultant that acts in their interest. So now we need to have a consultant, a credible technical international consultant who does all this modeling for us and advises us on the basis of their perception of risk in our best interest. At the moment, we don't have that. At least I don't see it. I don't see it in any of these approvals or these cabinet papers or anything like that. I don't see who is looking after the national interest other than the proponent of that paper. To me, that's an eminently fraught situation.
Exactly. And Sally, I think while you were away, your internet connection broke, we were discussing how we can develop that local talent. And perhaps Shiyana suggested, that's what's happening in some countries in the African region where when energy companies come in, they have to develop certain local talent, work with universities and young people. And perhaps that's maybe like, since I'm a PhD student, that's part of what's happening here in California. Like they're developing the local capacity here because part of their funding to our university comes as, like we develop the capacity here. Perhaps the Ministry of Energy might, in the future think that's a good investment to work with universities in Sri Lanka, develop that talent.
You'll be pleased to know that the Ministry of Energy has actually incorporated that into the new Petroleum bill, where the minister has a provision to secure the services of a competent qualified advisory service, advisory firm or entity, in order to assist the government in its assessment of risk. So yes, you're right, universities, but I think in this field, there are already people on the ground who do this for a living in not just in an academic sense, but these are people who are paid to cook projects, as in put them in the oven and bake them. Now, from that point of view, for every advisory company that a project proponent brings to the table, well, government can lawyer up and have an advisory company that advises in its interest. The secret is in the brief. So whether we work with whoever we work with, it's important that we include in the brief to them what interest we are talking about, because national interest is another wholly undefined term. So what does that mean it'll mean different things to the different people on this call. So we need to, that part is there, and Vidura is absolutely right. It is not addressed in a whole variety of ways. Ultimately, we come to the point that the risk has been, now take a PPA, for example, a power purchase agreement. By the time you get to signing off on a PPA, that whole process should be behind you. In other words, everybody must know what risk they're taking, how it is allocated, who's doing what. Now that those documents are still to this day negotiated in a room that nobody else has access to. So when you do that as a practice, then how do you talk about risk thereafter?
Exactly. Like I was going to ask, if you don't have access to the cabinet approved natural gas plants, then I don't know who does in Sri Lanka. So
well, that could be simply because it's a time factor. I mean, I've only been back in the energy advisory business on the government side for the last month or so. But the fact is, yes, it is a fact that ministries are not always talking to each other when putting these things together. And that's one of my main issues is the holistic view. I think Vidura mentioned this part of the national gas policy, or maybe it was one of you guys saying that it's not part of a holistic, larger policy. It's true, it's not.
Yes, and hopefully one of our objectives of really starting for this discussion at policy.lk is to start the discussion, give voices to young people, and really have that discussion going. And okay, and I think we really need to end like super fast. Time is running out. Shiyana, do you have final questions? And maybe afterwards we can ask Sally to make final comments, so that if anybody wants to contact you and keep in touch. Shiyana, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've done a great job in answering a lot of the tangential questions that I had and that I came up with ahead of this call. So I really appreciate your time, Sally, for speaking with us about natural gas and LNG in Sri Lanka. I think you shed quite a bit of light both on the market development side in terms of pricing and sector use of natural gas, but also in terms of the government policy and what we might it kind of gives us an idea of what we might be able to expect or what we should hope to expect. And so I do have I have a couple of questions, but I think that could be left offline. And I think we'll actually probably get quite a few questions later on as some people, have this sit in their head a little bit. I know that's true for me. So I think we can go ahead.
We have a lot of good questions. Maybe
if you have any one-word answer questions, shoot them now, and I'll restrict myself.
So Sally can incorporate them. Final comments, your questions.
Oh, for myself?
You could do.
Oh, okay. All right. Yes. Let me. See. I think. Well, one of my questions is really about the production sharing agreements that were considered. I think this is one question I posed to you previously, Saliya. Often these production sharing agreements will, I think they're called something differently in Sri Lanka, but they often set aside royalties, for example, or profit share for the government itself, which hopefully, the people of the country see in some way, in one way or the other. Sri Lanka is a democratic socialist country. So what does that look like in terms of the share that is taken from, the production of oil and gas that eventually might happen?
Okay, so that's definitely not a one-word answer, Shiyana, for that. But
I know.
The one-word answer is equitably, and the detail behind that is that it's a transparent agreement. It is unlike a PPA. The PRAs that Sri Lanka signs are on the web, so people are able to compute the difference of take between investor and state as the progress of as the project proceeds. And it's not a static picture, it's a dynamic picture. It varies with production, it varies with primarily production, but it actually after cost recovery. So it's a transparent share, and there's no one answer to cover all projects because projects are different sizes and different lengths, but it will be equitable and it will be visible.
And it's great that people can actually see what a sample, or what an example of one of these PRAs would be. So I think that was.
They're on the website.
Right.
So
exactly.
if you want to go and see the old CAN PRA, for example, it's on the website. You can download it and browse through it. The new PRAs are different. The model PRA is also on the website, and we have economic modeling software that speaks the same language as the oil and gas companies, so we can both talk the same kind of things. IRR, NPV, payback, all of that stuff will be boiled down to the simplest common denominators and not left confused and conditioned and out there as an unknown risk.
Absolutely. Well, I think that wraps up the questions that I had, those burning questions, and the ones that I thought that others would be interested in, especially when it comes to transparency in the oil and gas field in Sri Lanka. So Tisura, I don't know if you have any last words or any other questions.
Just like a final comment, and really I want to thank Saliya's time and Shiyana's time. You both are experts on natural gas, and I know Saliya has like a lot to talk about when it comes to natural gas. How Sri Lanka can be a regional player in South Asia when it comes to natural gas, and hopefully maybe we can have you again for another session to talk about that context entirely. Yeah, Saliya, do you have any final comments for the audience, and how you want to wrap things up in like maybe 1 minute's time?
I haven't really thought it out, so I'll go quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to set the right goals and spell those goals out, work out a strategy, and then challenge that strategy at every step. Because what is a goal today is not necessarily going to be a goal tomorrow. It's a very dynamic, fast-moving sector, the power sector, the energy sector as a whole. We are a very small player, so we can afford to experiment a little bit. What we cannot afford to do is continue to embrace old ideologies and old business models, be it the utility business model, be it the regulatory business model, whatever, because we are possessed of certain sovereign strengths in terms of location and natural resources. We must integrate them into any policy, leaving aside energy. And energy regional hub, there's a lot of potential in that, mostly for break bulking, but we can get into that on another call. All I'm saying is I'd like to say thank you for asking me to join your session. It's been a privilege, and also to speak to everybody who I have. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Saliya. And thank you to all the viewers who submitted questions and comments. I think that really added a special dynamic to this webinar. As Tisura mentioned, one of the key goals of these energy talks is to really have Sri Lankans, share their opinion, share some of their concerns about the direction that the energy sector is going, especially during this time where we're in the middle of a global energy transition and there's so many different factors at play. And Sri Lanka is a country where we're hoping for even more rapid economic growth, and energy is a key factor there. Without reliable, accessible, and affordable energy, we won't be able to see the kind of economic growth that we imagine for ourselves. So thank you so much for providing very transparent ideas and expertise on this subject, Saliya. We really appreciate it. And Tisura, thank you for having me on again for the second energy talks that I've been a part of. It's been very insightful, and as someone who wants to work in the energy sector in Sri Lanka and see Sri Lanka prosper, this has been such an exciting opportunity. And I think the audience enjoyed this as well. So I guess with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. And I will say that this is a recording, so others will be able to view this at a later time, and you'll be able to share it with your friends and colleagues as well. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great evening or morning to those of you on this side of the hemisphere.
Thank you all. Thank you, Saliya. Thanks, Shiyana. Take care.
Take care.